Welcome to the Trauma-Informed Lens podcast. I'm your host, Matt Bennett. Each episode we talk about the research and practical aspects of the trauma-informed movement. This podcast is not designed to replace mental health services. If you feel uncomfortable or triggered by our discussion, please consider seeking your own trauma treatment. In no way is seeking treatment an admission of weakness. It is a chance to build resiliency and experience post-traumatic growth. You can find show notes, resources, and more at traumainformedlens.org. Welcome, friends, to the Trauma-Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt Bennett. I got a very special guest today. Consider, when you can call somebody your friend, and Charlie, hopefully that's not presumptuous. Charlie attended a 4-session leadership training I did with the Metro Denver Homeless Initiative. And we have these breakout groups, and it wasn't all that talkative group. So I even think Charlie was holding back on me a little bit. But, when Charlie talked, I wanted to hear more. And Charlie was kind enough to, when I asked, hey, why don't we just record our conversation on a podcast? I just appreciate your flexibility. So Charlie, Fredrick, you made an amazing first impression, second, third, and fourth on me. So we're going to talk today about how do we bring the conversations about racial justice, equity, into our organization. So I'm incredibly excited to get into this, I think, really critical conversation. But first of all, introduce yourself to our listeners.
You're amazing, my friend. Thank you so much. Yeah, no, I'm really happy to have the conversation. I really enjoyed our trainings as well, and so I'm glad the energy was there for it. And this is such a, obviously an important topic to be talking about, particularly now, but anytime. And particularly, I think, also for white folks to be talking about, right? It's very easy for us to say, oh, well, we're in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We're in solidarity with American Indian movements, right? But like white supremacy is our problem that we created, right? So like we got to talk about it.
Yes.
So I'm here for it. But yeah, so, my name is Charlie. They, them pronouns are great. I am the Senior Human Services Coordinator currently at the Community College of Denver. Before that, I've only been in Colorado for about 2 years. And before that, I was out in San Francisco for the past 11 years. But I'm originally from rural Missouri, backwoods Missouri. So traditional Osage territory, right? Give some land acknowledgement, I think is also important. But so that's where I grew up. That's where I was politicized. I've been doing the work ever since.
Yes. We kind of start out from a deficit, I found out. I've been trying to catch up, I think, ever since I left Indiana. And not that there isn't great folks in Indiana, I'll be very clear. I just didn't grow up in one of those places per se. So let me just kind of throw the question out to you is one of the things that I think is really difficult a lot of times, especially still in a lot of organizations. I definitely see this here in Colorado. And by the way, it's not every organization, but the further you get up in the systems, the further you get up in organizational charts or system hierarchies, the wider things get. And there's this great movement in our community, which is desperately needed, and around the country for Black Lives Matter, and everything that sort of goes around with that. I think while in the helping professions, and most listeners to our podcast are in the helping, healing, education, healthcare professions, we are more aware of our privilege, but I'd love to get your thoughts on how do we take what's going on in the community and create safe places to have conversations about addressing systematic racism, discrimination, bias within our organizations. And so I'll start you out with a simple question.
Just a real light toss.
Yes.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think to step, into that a little bit is we obviously cannot separate our organizations from the cultures that we operate in, right? Both internally, the individual level, interpersonally with our coworkers, with our clients, but then also just with the community that we serve, right? And even that terminology and that language of serving has a lot of connotations built into it, right? That I have the power to give you something, right? I mean, so even if we have to kind of think about even that language, right? And then, what does it mean to create safe space is a whole different level of conversation within that, right? And so I think part of the immediate answer to that question is like, we just have to be human enough to have the conversations, right? And I think particularly for white folks, it's getting real comfy with discomfort, right? Because I think that for a lot of us, I will also speak from my own personal experience in this, we have a very quick knack and tendency to try to fix something immediately. Like, oh, there is something flashy happening outside. Let's have 2 or 3 conversations about how important Black people are in our office and then move on, right? That's usually more damaging than helpful, frankly, right? And we just have to be able to create the space in our offices to really do the deeper work, right? And so when I talk about deeper work, I literally mean culture shift work, right? And what does it mean to do transformational organization shift work, right? And that culture shift work isn't in a work plan. That culture shift work isn't just in a like, by next month we will have achieved culture shift, right? It is really laying the groundwork to build foundations of trust, to be comfortable with a process that is organic, right? That is nonlinear, and that takes into account that we have deep-seated, embodied value structures that we did not give ourselves and we don't even intellectually agree with, that we're going to have to unlearn and remold, right? And so it's even just starting at that place before you can even have the conversations.
Great. So when you say non-linear, I like that. And I get that the is somebody who's worked with a lot of organizations to, and I hate the terminology, but become trauma informed. It's not attending a half-day training. It's a deeper process. But as a facilitator, part of my work in some way is maybe not making it linear, because I get that you have to be there. There's got to be a level of flexibility in there, but to try to find some structure, because people find some safety within that structure. So I'd love for you to expand on the concept of that non-linear your piece here, because I think that flexibility is so critical, but I might be missing a deeper meaning there too.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, nonlinear is recognizing that just like any relationship, right? Whether it's a dating relationship, whether it's a coworker relationship, whatever, right? You don't just start from scratch and immediately go from A to B to C, right? There's got to be some walkarounds, right? And I think in my experience with organizations, particularly around issues of race, the knee-jerk reaction is to say, particularly for trauma-informed folks, right, is okay, as a white person, to my coworkers of color, to my employees of color, what do you need, right? But the thing is, then people tell us what they need, and we don't actually want to do those things, right? Because those things take work, those things take time, those things take giving up power, those things take restructuring, right? Those things don't just have a piece of paper in the HR folder somewhere that fixes it, right? And so that's what I mean by nonlinear.
Yeah. I wonder how, because I think this kind of hit towards the end of my training, where during this whole series, I realized I had way too much content. So I had these pretty crazy manic stretches towards the end. But one of the things I challenge leaders to think deeply about, and I just kind of wonder if you see a connection here, is how, and I'll go from a linear perspective and maybe you can break it down, is how do we push intentionally power down the organization? Collaborative decision making is sometimes the label from, I like the word democracy, because I believe if you sit with that word for a second, even though it's incredibly charged, if you think about what it really means, it means as a leader, I put myself in a very vulnerable position. I shift my inherent kind of to my position power to other folks. And when I hear you talk, I think about, is this the time where a maybe strategic initiative to really shift power down, especially if power looks more white, and lower down the organization structurally might look more diverse, to do that. I just love to give you your thoughts on that, because democracy is such a core piece of my trauma-informed leadership thinking. And maybe this is a time to think about that in a deeper way.
Well, I mean, that's right. That's important, because you can't separate issues of race, racism, white supremacy from issues of power, right? Yeah. And I think particularly in nonprofits, particularly in social service organizations, we have a very ambivalent relationship to power, right? We can talk about people in need. We can talk about kind of like getting people like some services, but really challenging and really thinking about power external to ourselves and internal to ourselves is something that we really struggle with, right? And particularly when we turn that gaze internal, right? It's like, well, if we really care about the work, we care about supporting the people, we would never start questioning the internal power structures of our organizations, right? Like, we would never possibly do that. Yeah. But frankly, you have to do that in order to really do this work, right? And so whenever you talk about democracy, I'm not against the term democracy. I agree that it's charged, right? But I would ask, what kind of democracy, right? Yeah. I would ask, like, what are you actually trying to get out of decision making, right? So there's representative democracy, which we could have all kinds of conversations about, or participatory democracy, right? And I think there are lots of ways to really think about what are the intentions of who makes decisions, who has to then deal with the outcomes and the fallouts of decisions, and how do you actually restructure that in an equitable way so that the people who are most impacted, either because of the work that we're doing or because of the lives that they live, are the ones at the center of those decision-making structures, right? So I think that's part of that organizational culture shift work. And there's lots of amazing organizations that help folks do that deeper dive work, right? There are a lot of, anti-oppression or racial justice like audits that exist out there, right? There are a lot of really amazing folks like the Aorta Cooperative that do really powerful work to do that for folks, right? So from that perspective, there are obviously structures in place. It's not just like a free-for-all the whole time, right? Yeah. But the reason why I'm so resistant to the idea of a linear structure is because, like, you have to make space for people to have authentic feelings. If you're going to be trauma-informed, you got to let people actually have trauma, right? Yeah. And you got to make sure that you have space in your office to hold that, right? Yeah. And so, again, from my experience in my current job, we are a very small, I say small but scrappy human services team, which is housed under the Office of Student Life in our community college, right? And by small, I mean we are literally 1.75 full-time staff and 4 part-time work study students, right? Small. Yes. But we make a point to hire our work study students from the community that we serve, not only from a student perspective, of course, but we want to make sure that our students are living the experiences that they're going to be helping their peers with. So we have single parents who are full-time students. We have people who have been formerly homeless who are our work study students. We have people who have experienced chemical dependencies and harms and interpersonal violence, right? Because we want folks to be able to have a lived sense of what our students are going through when they come to us asking for help, right? So that's part of that centering the margins work, but that also means that our work study students are gonna come with a whole host of traumas that are gonna quote unquote impact how they show up at work, right? And you can pretend like that doesn't exist, and you can kind of just like hammer it down and be like, nope, we got 9 to 5, we got to do this thing, you have an intake to do, right? But I really try to create a culture in our office where our work study students feel safe to show up in their full selves, right? And I think that kind of work is really what it's going to take to start unpacking our norms, right? To kind of get to your bigger questions, right? You can't decolonize your office if you don't first have a conversation about how are we currently colonized, right?
And I that's such a powerful statement there. I love that. So the other, because the thing that I think about, and I've really been challenging One of the things that I've really tried to take time to do as the whole Black Lives Matter movement is shut up and listen and think about, okay, how did I do this in the past and how might I do this better or more sensitive in the future? And, I think, and this is the MBA and me kind of talking and all my quality work is let's get a committee together. Like, let's get a group of people together to talk about racial justice within our organization. And while I think the MBA in me still says, okay, that probably would have how I still do it. Let's say you have an organization, a school, whatever it might be. Let's say you got 100 staff, full, part-time, interns, whatever it might be, and you really want to have a genuine discussion that leads to progress. What would, again, my MBA quality, which I know is really structured. I mean, you don't get more white than Taylorism and all these past business model things out there. I mean, Taylorism to me is like, I just got done reading A Brave New World again. Like yes, this is whiteness embodied in an organizational theory. What do you think about let's get a committee together, even if I did it right? What do you think about that, like, approach and reaction to say, hey, all 100 of us can't have this conversation in a room together in a meaningful way? Do you have any thoughts on what advice could we give if somebody says, I really want to do this, just I need to figure out how to start it?
Totally. So I think working backwards from kind of what you're bringing forward, I think that a lot of white folks, myself included, right? I don't think are hearing folks of color correctly when they tell us to shut up and listen.
Yeah.
So that's context specific, right? Yeah. A big part of why we're in the mess that we're in is because too many white folks are quiet.
Yeah.
Right? It's about the context of where we talk too much, which is when we normally talk over people of color and decide that we have all the answers, right? That's when we should shut up, right? That's when we follow our BIPOC leaders, right?
Yeah.
But in our families, in our homes, in our coworker relationship with other white folks, like, we shut up way too much, right? So that's my first kind of like reframe of that, of like, we actually have to talk a lot more than what we are, but within context, right?
Great point.
So I'm not going to show up to the Black Lives Matter rally and decide that I'm the one that should be talking in the microphone, right? Yeah. There are a lot of white folks, myself included, like in the past, that may have done that, right? Those are the spaces that we need to be quiet. And other spaces in our workspaces, we need to talk a lot more, right? And I think, to your point about let's get a committee together. I think my question is why, or what's the intent behind the committee? Because one of those other kind of knee-jerk, white supremacy culture characteristics is like that impulse to of urgency to fix something, right? Yeah. And again, I think that is like a tendency to move away from discomfort. It's like a shift of like, well, this doesn't feel good. Here's my action plan to make me feel better, right? And I think that it's I think that it's important that we sit back and like, okay, well, but why a committee, and why are we in this context, two white male socialized people, the ones creating a committee? Yeah. Right, in this example, right? So I would start off by asking why and what's the hope behind it, right? And I would go back to my earlier conversation of like talking to our folks of color in our offices and doing more of a needs assessment of like, what's it like in our office right now, right? And what do you need? And being able to actually hear that, listen to that. And if they say a committee, then let's do it, right? Yeah. While also trying to balance that. We want to provide leadership opportunities. We want to make sure that we as white folks, and whatever roles that we have, right? Like I, as a senior human services coordinator, have like very little relative power in my organization, comparatively speaking. However, I do still have clout, right? Yeah. And so where we have that clout, it's our role as white folks to use it to create the space, to give folks of color room to have the feelings, to make the movements that we need to be making, right? Yeah. So that's my non-answer answer to your question about your community.
Okay, so let's say, because I can't not have a committee, that there's eventually we decide to have a committee. But the other thing that I have seen so many times, and I've learned to, like, I wouldn't say I learned to, when I feel like, and I shared this with the audience a few episodes ago, when I first saw the signs about defund the police. I had this kind of reaction, like something in my gut, like, said, and I love the research on the gut. When your gut reacts, you think something's poisonous, and I'm like, okay, I got that feeling. I need to go research this. Again, a very structural thing for me to do, and learn more about it. I've seen so many people, and I would say with good intentions, maybe not good execution, but good intentions, say, hey, let's get the committee together. They hear things they don't like about the truth being stated at the table, which means you've maybe created a little bit of psychological safety, or people are just so pissed off that they're going to tell you the truth and take that risk. And it shuts everything down. And I wonder, like I said, I've learned that unconscious bias, the unconscious, I love the term unconscious incompetence. And that's, to me, that gut reaction to, defund the police. Well, I had to go back and realize, well, what if every time I stepped out of my house, I was worried that that system might kill me, or my children, or my family or community members. So what advice might you give to someone who's doing all good intentions and then gets hit with a lot of stuff they may not have been aware of, and that does not feel good at all to sit with?
Yes. So a couple of pieces again from that is, I go back to my question of why the committee, right? Because if the point is to learn about the problems and issues and structural racism that are happening in your organization, then you better be ready to hear about the racism and structural problems in your organization,
Yes. Yep.
right? Because that's what you set it up for, right? But my other question, I guess, with that is, like, what power do you have and are you giving to the folks in that committee to make the changes, right? Because if it's just a processing circle, you are literally just inviting folks to, like, have more racial battle fatigue that they don't have capacity for, they don't have time for, and frankly, you don't have energy to deal with, right?
Great. I hope everybody heard those words. Yes.
Because folks are tired, folks are exhausted, right? And, like, white folks are tired and exhausted too, but frankly, I think that's a huge cop-out on our end to say that it's the same thing, right? Yeah. It's not the same thing, right? We get, like, a scratch of having someone trust us enough, frankly, have enough investment in our relationship to tell us what's happening, and then we're all of a sudden, quote unquote, fatigued, right? Like, that purely is, like, again, what I would call, like, a weaponized white fragility, right? And so that's something that I think, again, going back to why the committee, making sure that you're setting yourself up for success and not failure, right? Like, a lot of organizational change plans are, like, have, like, that readiness component before you even start doing the work, right? And so, like, doing some readiness testing is going to be important before you open up, those conversations, because you're going to hear things, right? I mean, my other question is, I see this happening on college campuses across the country, lots of town halls and lots of dialogues with students, like, what are you seeing on campus? What do you need? Like, how is racism showing up, at XYZ university? It's like, do you really not know the answer, or is this your performative allyship? Right? Because, like, I can't imagine for, like, the 500 plus years of colonization and slavery that you don't get racism exists, right? So, like, why the town halls? Why the like, what are you experiencing in the office, right? Because you know the answers.
Can I challenge you on that, though? Because and again, Missouri and Indiana are different places. If you've never been to either of the two, it's special in its own way. I've actually, and I've tried to be, when you say speaking up, and I'm not sure if I'm doing the world any good or not, one of the places where I've tried to have a voice, which I really almost never do anything personal on, is social media. And I'm connected to a lot of friends that I went to high school in Indiana with and college in Kentucky with. And while I would hope that if you get hired at a university or you get hired in a helping organization, that you've gone through some process internally to look at this. I also, I want to I'm more out of jest than any solid push back to say, do you really, when you look around, do you see people have done that work to have that level of insight? Because I would argue that a lot of people that I see online, they would never call themselves racist. And I've gone round and round with my own family, and I really believe they believe it, but boy, is it racist. And I just kind of wonder, is there any gauge that we can have to make sure, hey, we're not one of them, and we are someone who has done at least a little bit of that work ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, so I hear you, right, that folks haven't done the deeper engagement work, particularly, again, when I say folks here, I'm talking about fellow white folks doing that work. Because you're right, folks are still really stuck in this, in the ladder of becoming anti-racist, not just non-racist or non-racial, right? One of the things that white supremacy does to white people is de-racializes us, right? It hyper-racializes everybody else and de-racializes us. And so it's very easy for individual white folks to be like, well, everyone else is like me and we're all equal. And as long as I'm not explicitly mean to people, like everything is great. That is like the baseline kind of narrative that I hear a lot of folks having in work culture, right? And it's that level of rupture that has to happen in that narrative cycle to start the real work, right? Yeah. And so like if you're asking people in a genuine way, like help me understand what I'm not seeing because I'm in my cycle, sure, great. Then maybe you haven't seen it, right? But there are so many books, there are so many movements, there are so many webinars that like if it's 2020 and you're like, I wonder why there's a national, international at this point, Black Lives Matter movement, you clearly haven't done the work to research it. Yeah. Right? You don't need, Barbara down the hall from you to tell you the racism she experiences, right? If that's something that you're like just now starting to recognize that that's a thing happening, there are enough resources out there for you to find that out. Yeah. So that's what I mean by people already know.
Great point. Right? Yeah, and a challenge to never. This is something I really never think you've arrived. I think that's the whole. Like reading White Fragility was part of my learning curve, and then I thought, okay, I took some things. I got challenged by it, which I like. If I'm not, then I'm wasting my time. And then listening to some podcasts with some Black leaders who are saying we've got some problems with this, and saying, okay, maybe I can take a little bit of good out there. I can still be challenged, but I need to listen to these voices too. So, I think, a lot of what I see is some of my white friends, you never really arrive. There's too much to learn, unconscious bias is tricky because it's unconscious until it gets revealed. So, it's always that, I think, work that needs to be a continuous part of our development. And
we live in a white supremacy culture, right? Like, yes, you're not just going to magically like empty yourself of the culture that you live in, right? We talked about that very earlier on, right? You can't divorce your organization from the community. You can't divorce yourself and your training from the culture that trained you, right? Yeah. And that's the same for everybody across the board, and it shows up differently for different folks, right?
Absolutely. So one of the interesting questions, because I know that this falls in, what I love about you, and I'll just say this ahead of time because I usually don't like to put a whole lot of workload on my guests because you're just generous enough to give an hour of your time. But I know you've got links ready to go. So that's it's great when you look at the chat in Zoom and Charlie's throwing out many links. So I'll ask him to share, or excuse me, they to share that in the notes as well. question of just my mistake with pronouns, which I apologize for, was leading to my question is heterosexualism as part of this. With the Black Lives Matter movement, a focus on Black trans lives. I know, and I'm saying what I hear from folks in the LGBTQ plus community, a lot of racism and stuff existing in that community as well. Is there, in your thinking, a way, because we got a lot of work to do on the heterosexualism piece as well, to be more inclusive in that way as well? It seems like we've got a window open to discuss this, and I'd love to just get your thoughts as someone, again, through your links and getting to know you the little I have, as somebody who thinks in that arena as well. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that piece too.
So I wholeheartedly agree. All straight people have some stuff to deal with. So yes. And I think what a piece of that, right, of us, what I would consider cissexism and heteronormativity, right, is this idea that like so many folks, I'm not gonna say everybody, so many folks are like confused or awe-inspired, whether you consider that positive or negative, that the movement for Black Lives and that Black Lives Matter specifically as an organization and as like, a network and a movement centers and comes from Black femmes, Black women, Black trans folks. People are baffled. People are like, oh, this is beautiful, this is amazing. Or like, why are they doing that? Or that's, y'all, like, Black queer and trans folks, Black women have always been at the center of all this work, right? Yeah. And so like, you can't separate racism from sexism from classism, right? Women of color feminism is so central to our liberation struggles that like it shouldn't surprise anybody that this movement is being led by those folks, right? So I don't know if that's answering your question, but like we have a deep lineage, right, of LGBTQ folks, right, QTPOC folks, Black femmes, right, leading this movement, right? And we got to stop wondering why that's happening, right? Right. Yeah. Like it's important for us to really decenter what I would call like a cisnormative lens, right? And a heteronormative lens. The way that labor is gendered in our society, in our culture anyway, right? I think about, essential workers, right, who are in our culture essentially disposable, right, are also those same Black women and Black queer folks and Black trans folks, right? And so, of course, those are the folks who are going to be leading our liberation struggles, right? Mm-hmm. They are at multiple points of intersections of systemic violence. Yeah.
Excellent point. So let me get a little bit more specific around this, because I think if I'm hearing you correctly as well, trust and psychological safety. We talked about this a lot in the training. I thought you had some great insight on this as well. I think trust we kind of get, but don't assume it's there. But the concept, and I'd love to get your thoughts on. When I say psychological safety as being a foundation to have these discussions, and without it, I've seen these go really, really bad too over my 25 years, and seeing them, even though it probably points out cracks that already exist, really destroys morale, and it takes an organization, if they ever do recover, a long time if it's not there. So as you think about opening up these conversations, doing this meaningful and difficult work, how do you think about psychological safety? You can throw trust in there as well, into setting something like this up to have really meaningful impacts eventually, or in my language, outcomes.
No, I think that's important because, to me, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, but there's particularly for white folks engaging in multiracial, multi-ethnic work, right? It is really critical that we are interrogating the difference between safety and comfort. Yes. Right? Yeah. And I can't count the number of times my white folks, again, historically myself included, claim a lack of safety when we are just deeply uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Right? And in a culture that teaches us that we are the center of everything, it is very decentralizing and very destabilizing to learn otherwise, right? And so, I think to get to the goal that I hear in your question without engaging in psychological safety, it is, again, set yourself up for success, right? Like if you're doing this work, if you're seeing yourself struggle, if you're noticing that you're getting defensive, right, that your like resiliency muscle is not being able to be flexed right now, right? Hopefully you have enough stamina, you have enough groundedness in yourself that you see that. And that is a moment where you need to be like, I need folks that I can lean on for support, that I can process this with, that are not the folks of color who are pulling me in and trying to hold me accountable.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because something that I learned, and I think a lot of folks have to learn just by process and by doing, you can't learn that through a book, is that call out culture can feel and be really toxic, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not explicitly harmful if done in a way to call you in, right? Because that is showing already a level of trust that these folks have in you, that they're willing to call you out on your crap, right?
Yeah.
And because like they see a value in you, that they're willing to be like, yo, you need to work on this thing so you can show up for us better.
Right. Yeah.
And you need to hear that, right?
Yeah.
It might not feel cute, it might not feel comfortable, right? But you need to hear that people love you enough to be like, yo, you're not coming forward in a real way for us, and we need you to shift so that you can.
Yeah. And it goes back to like, my thought is because, so much of this, whether you're talking democracy, is really, you've got to have the foundation of psychological safety and trust. And for psychological safety and trust, you have to have that based upon, when I teach leadership, from honesty and being able to really confront those brutal facts. Now, when you have power, sometimes that can be a little, it's never necessarily easy, but this to me is kind of being comfortable enough in your own self to feel uncomfortable, right? To say, okay, if you're not walking into these meetings or committees or whatever and ready to be uncomfortable, you're not ready to do the work. And yet I think it's okay to appreciate that's going to be hard for everybody sitting at that table, because just because you are being, confronted on something, which you probably ask people to do, the person also doing the confronting is taking a much larger risk, especially if in the organizational structure there is a power differentiation that's existing there.
I mean, absolutely. To have staff feel grounded enough to name, call out, whatever buzzword you want to use, their experiences to their supervisor, right? That is a ton of emotional labor and frankly putting themselves at economic risk, right? And it's those structural forms of what I would consider violence that people who are in middle management, upper management, whatever that looks like, right, really have to sit with, right? And really have to recognize, like, I've been in so many meetings where like, okay, in this meeting, all titles are dropped. We're all here together for the same purpose. And that's just such a load of nonsense.
Yeah.
I'm not here for that. I'm just not here for it.
Yeah.
It's always the lower ranked staff, or it's always the staff who come from a marginalized, identity, who will trust that, right? And will name the experiences, will give the feedback when asked, like, hey, tell us what we're doing wrong. Hey, tell us how we can be doing better. It's always that working class person. It's always that person of color. It's always that trans person who is like, cool, I'm going to meet you where you're at. I'm going to trust you. I'm going to answer your question honestly. And then it's the clapback, right? Racially speaking, we're calling that, white backlash, right? We hear a lot of those things. And so I think it's very harmful to set people up like that and not be able to actually hear the feedback.
Yeah, great point. And and again, this is not my leadership training, but that level of that mindfulness piece, I just keep, if you're given that power from the organizational structure perspective, you've got to be that calm. You've got to be able to hear it, and contemplate on it and be okay. And I think it's a real challenge for a lot of leaders. You're not going to solve this in a meeting.
You're not gonna solve it in a meeting. You also aren't gonna solve it if you're not willing to let go of stuff, right?
Excellent. Yeah.
And let go of stuff, either personally and ego stuff, right? Of like, oh, I didn't make this program perfect or magical for everyone involved, right?
Yeah.
And let go of that arrogance that like your program might suck.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But also to let go of other things like power, right?
Yeah.
We talked about the ambivalence of power earlier, right? But it's like, if you're literally asking folks, what can we do differently? How do we change the culture? How do we make this, how do we make our organization an explicitly racial justice and or anti-racist organization? That's gonna mean shifting power. And you gotta be okay with that shift, because it's gonna come.
Yeah. So the other thing that I'd love to get any thoughts that you might have on it is, because at one point, I think probably a community college is a great example of this, is there's work to do internally, and there's also advocacy to do in the community. And I wonder, I mean, it's kind of a question, and not to put you on the spot, but knowing that, like I said, the community college you work for is, sort of on those front lines and living that of bringing folks from lived experience and giving them opportunities to thrive. So how would you see that, okay, we've got work to do inside, but what is our role to support this, advocate for this in the community, knowing that, these organizations we work for have power in our brands and in our work that we do?
Yeah, it's a both and, right? Like, you can't serve the people if you're not serving like the people who work for you.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a both and, right? I mean, like, so Community College of Denver is a really great institute, and we're like a majority student of color campus. We are a majority, quote unquote, non-traditional student campus, whatever that means these days. But in practice, what that means is a lot of first generation folks, right? A lot of returning folks coming from, living life and coming back to school later on in life. I very much personally fit into that camp. And so we have a lot of students who aren't like the traditional fresh out of high school experience. And so this narrative of, oh, when you get to the real world, you'll learn these skills, just like doesn't make sense anymore, right? Yeah. Like, I don't know that it ever made sense, frankly, but it definitely does not make sense now, right? And for this work, there's a movement elder, Utah Phillips. He was an old
rock salt and nails.
Yeah, so good. Okay, great. I say his name, and half people know who I'm talking about. The other half have no idea what I'm saying. So he said one time, some semblance, I'm definitely paraphrasing, but that freedom is something that you assume, and you wait for someone to take it away from you. And the degree that you resist is the degree that you're actually free, right? Wonderful. And so how I take that in my, like nonprofit work or like professional work in this setting is a sword and shield kind of mentality, right? Within direct service, that if I'm purely just providing direct service, I'm actually providing a disservice, because I'm not actually moving people out of the crisis that they're in when they come to my office. I'm just giving them enough crumbs to live until tomorrow. Yeah. Right. And so, Urbana Vita is an organization that does a lot of really awesome housing and tenant rights organizing out in Boston. And their organizing model is called the Sword and Shield model. And I personally just have really adopted that for all of my life practices. And that's that idea of the shield being our direct services work. That's getting you on TANF, that's getting you on SNAP, that's getting you a shelter bed for the night, right? Because we live in crisis, and it is critical that we don't let people sit in crisis, right? But that sword work is a combination of tactics and strategies, right? That it's everything from policy creation and development to advocacy work to direct action organizing and community-based building, right? That's going to expand and change the terrain in which people live, right? So they're not constantly always in crisis, right? It's breaking that cycle. So it's a both and. And so literally how that works for me personally to try to answer directly any of your questions today, is how do we create that space where we have control to create the space, right? So I am a project of the Department of Student Life, right? So the Department of Student Life, we have our own things going on. Community Colleges of Denver has its own things going on, right? In my little sphere of influence, you know, in human services, we create a culture, you know, we create a learning culture. So our work study students, part of their work plan is also a wellness plan, right? And that is a personal wellness plan that I require of my staff that they incorporate into their work plan, but I never ask them what it is they are doing, right? I want them to have that for themselves, but I want them to clock hours taking care of themselves, right? I also ensure that, you know, I think a lot of folks would frame this as like professional development, but like I would call it political analysis because that's kind of the framing that I come from. So we're in webinars, right? Like we had our staff last night on the Movement for Black Lives webinar around Black trans women in leadership, right? And so then they're going to give a report back at our staff meeting later on this week about that, right? Because that really influences how we show up for our Black trans students when they come to our office, right? And so it's that idea of like, how do we create a learning culture? How do we create a culture where we can ask questions? How do we create a culture where we're like, who benefits from our current practices? Who doesn't benefit from our current practices? And how do we shift them? It's doing that kind of work, you know. I talk about both and thinking rather than either or thinking, because am I going to single-handedly like transform an institution? Probably not, right? Maybe, probably not, right? And right, I have a small sphere of influence that we can model a different work culture than a normative work culture, right? We can model a work culture in my sphere of influence where when you come for supervision, it's not how can I catch you at doing your job wrong? It's how can I make sure that you don't have barriers to doing your work that are not being addressed by our office, right? So whenever our students, you know, miss deadlines or like, you know, like they didn't finish a project on time, my first question isn't, why didn't you get me this thing on time? My question is, what happened that this fell off your plate, right? And sometimes that is, I forgot because I'm in 16 credit hours of like high theory classes, right? And sometimes it's because my grandma died or like, I was racially profiled and I spent the weekend in jail or like whatever that looks like for them, right? And I, as a supervisor, as a manager, if I'm gonna ask the question, what happened, right? And what barriers exist, again, I gotta be ready to actually then hear it and move with it, right? And so it's like, great, how do we support you in that moment of crisis, whether that's like, you know, whatever that's happening for you in your personal life, and how do we flex your hours so that you don't lose pay, right? Because I think the traditional kind of like care mentality of a supervisor is, oh, it sounds like you have a lot going on right now. Why don't you take some unpaid leave and address your personal issues? Well, plot twist, if you deprive people of a paycheck, they're gonna have a lot more personal issues. Right? And so it's like, do we have formal office hours? Absolutely. We totally have formal office hours, 8 to 5 every day, right? Can my students who, you know, live at the intersections of different forms of violence and you know, and racism and crisis always operate at their full best 8 to 5 every day? Certainly not. So how do we show up in a way that lets them actually do the work that they need to be doing to support our students when they can actually do that work, both for themselves and when the students are ready to hear that work, right? So it's about that flexibility. It's about being organic. It's about being nonlinear, you know, to come full circle, right? And it's about being adaptive, right? And I'm sure that there are all kinds of fancy buzzwords around resiliency about what that looks like. But at the end of the day, it's about not being a prick. It's about being a human, right? And being like, oh, you have something happening in your life. Oh, you brought me this really valuable piece of feedback. Let's work on it. Let's shift some things around. Let's make this work. How can we continue to advance our mission and our values, right? And like not worry about your work plan or like what time you clock in the next day, right?
So I'm good. I feel like I could go. I feel like every question I have though is huge. Like I'm just like, how do I let? There's this working class language here. Oh, I want to. I'm go. Like I told you before we got on here. This is the first one we'll do together because
Code switching is a never-ending skill set, right?
yes.
And like, as a working class person, as a person who finished my degree as of like 2 weeks ago, after 18 years of being too poor to finish it on my own, right? Code switching in middle class professional culture is something that you got to learn and relearn and relearn and relearn. And at the same time, you also have to be authentic to yourself,
Yeah.
right?
Yes. Yeah.
And maybe, again, I always kind of joke that maybe it's my working class tenacity, but like, if you ask for my opinion, I'm going to come at you in my real truth, right? And sometimes that means that I use words and language or intonations and inflections in my voice that make middle class folks a little unsettled.
Yeah. And we just spent like, 30 minutes saying that's where you need to be. So Charlie can do that to you. And if you can't take it, it's your fault. So I do want to do maybe an easier question though the list might be long. If you were to recommend any books, you can go up maybe recent ones or resources, or like the top ones about maybe looking at the topics we talked about today, which was wide ranging. What would you put on folks' reading list?
Great question. So what I'm sitting with, so folks like, they're not seeing my like embodied response to that question. What I'm sitting with is like, sure, I have like, my partner's an academic. I'm like what I would consider a grassroots academic. Our entire house is like full of books. I could give you a jillion books. Right?
I figured you'd pick one or two up at some point. Yeah.
But I am also really sitting with this of like part of, dismantling white supremacy culture is to get out of our heads and actually just like feel things, right? And I don't know that you can fully read a book that's going to make you feel things, right? But again, in an attempt to answer any of your questions directly, Stacey Hines, her book, Politics of Trauma, I think is a really powerful book. I think particularly it was really impactful for me to help to see where I had embodied or metabolized white supremacy culture or other forms of trauma that I've experienced as a queer and non-binary person, as a working class person in middle class culture, to see how I've taken that physically in, and then how I spit that back out at other people in really harmful ways, right? And so I think from a transformative change mentality and not just sitting in transactional change thinking, I think that book and like that, that sense of how do we actually do somatics work in a deeper like way, in a politicized somatics way, not just I'm gonna like add body feelings to like my counseling practice.
Right.
I think is really critical and really important, right?
Great. I will throw that on my list as well. So,
but
Charlie,
I would also just say, I mean, there are a jillion books, so read books. But
yes.
Reading books, reading academic theory is not where everyone's entry point is, right? And so for white folks, there's Showing Up for Racial Justice. They have amazing series of workshops. They have local chapters everywhere. You can learn that stuff through those spaces. But I would also say, Movement for Black Lives and their cohorts of organizations around the country are doing such powerful work. And they are gracious enough to have so many webinars that we can sit in and silently as white folks learn from, right? And a lot of those folks aren't asking money for those trainings. And if you go to those trainings, I highly, highly, highly encourage you to make some donations, because that's also part of that learning work, is that reparations work, right? So like if books aren't your thing, right? If you don't have time to sit and like read, high theory about like, race relations in the US for the past however many years, cool. Go to like a 2-hour webinar, go to a 1-hour webinar. Like you can like, I don't know, do your spin class while you're doing it if you really have to, right? But like, there are a lot of resources out there for sure.
Awesome. Well, Charlie, thank you so much. I knew we'd have plenty to talk about. Charlie also sent me a list of potential future topics. So if I didn't bug him too much on this episode, Charlie, hopefully I can get you back sometime soon. I feel like there's a lot in your head I would love to explore, and I appreciate your giving your learning and wisdom to our audience as well. So I really appreciate
Absolutely.
that.
No, thank you for the invite. I mean, like I consider these kind of virtual coffee shop / dinner table style conversations, and I think that's such important work and has played such a pivotal role in the history of racial justice, right? Is like those dinner conversations that, I'm always here for it. I am a person, of white skin privilege and male socialization, but like I'm here for it. So anytime that it makes sense, I'm happy to be back.
And I'll put any information Charlie wants to share, and they'll probably send me some links in there as well, I would imagine. So I love the resources. So those will be in the show notes, traumainformedlens.org. And thank you everyone for joining us, and we'll see you soon. Take care.